Podolsk, Russia, right on the outskirts of the capital, Moscow. This is not a front line, but the heart of the homeland, declared a safe zone by the Kremlin. However, the final evidence leaked from Russian telegram channels and spread across social media is indistinguishable from that of a war zone. Messages typed with trembling, frozen fingers document an internal collapse. No water, no electricity, no heating. This is not speculation, but a painful reality experienced by millions of Muscovites. The Kremlin's special military operation propaganda froze to death that night in the icy pipes of Podolsk's apartment buildings. The war has truly come home to Russia. So how did this ultimate chaos begin? On the night of October 21, 2025, the Russian Federation experienced one of the most coordinated and deepest waves of attacks since the start of the war. But this time, the targets were not just ammunition depots or military bases. Ukraine's intelligence target list was designed to directly pierce Moscow's energy shield. This was an operation to pull the plug on the capital's life support system. Initial data revealed 2 critical strikes confirmed by military bloggers' sources. The first occurred in the Smolensk Oblast. The main power plant, the heart of regional power generation, was hit by multiple long-range kamikaze drones. NASA-firm satellite data confirmed a massive fire in the main block of the facility, which burned out of control throughout the night and was visible from miles away. This plant was a key part of the main grid supplying not only the city of Smolensk, but also the Moscow metropolitan area from the west. Its destruction meant the immediate loss of hundreds of megawatts of power from the grid. The second strike occurred in Bryansk Oblast. The critical transformer station in the True VK area in particular was destroyed with surgical precision. This was no ordinary transformer. This facility functioned as a distribution node. In other words, it was a key that received high-voltage electricity and distributed it to smaller settlements, military facilities, and civilian infrastructure around Moscow. The loss of Truevka meant that even if electricity was generated, it could not reach the outer ring of the capital. These targets were never random. This was the final stage of Ukraine's Strangle Moscow strategy. To understand this strategy, one must grasp the dual-layer strangulation strategy. The first layer, the strategic phase, had been struck just days earlier on October 18th. That day, Ukrainian drones flew more than 900 km deep, reducing the Veshkimer 500 kV main transformer station on the Volga River to ashes. This meant cutting off the main HS line, the main artery feeding Moscow. This was hitting the system's main generator. However, this attack triggered the second layer. Another attack on October 21st triggered the tactical phase. Ukraine was no longer just targeting the main source, Veshka, 900 km away. It was systematically destroying Smolensk and Bryansk, the capital's circuit breakers. In the first phase, they blew up the main water pipes of buildings. In the second phase, they broke the valves leading to each apartment. The attacks on Smolensk and Bryansk were exactly that. They were critical nodes in the internal distribution network surrounding Moscow and providing it with its last lifeline. As Russian grid operators desperately tried to redirect electricity to Western lines to compensate for the strategic loss at Veshkimer, Ukraine cut off these backup routes as well. This was military genius. It turned the greatest weakness of Russia's energy grid, its centralized and fragile structure, into a weapon. The grid now had no flexibility, no spare capacity left. On the night of October 21st, fires in Smolensk and Bryansk burned not only transformers, but also Moscow's last line of defense. The capital was choked off simultaneously from both its main arteries and its capillaries. The siege was complete. This final blow on October 21st was not planned overnight. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign of destruction that Ukraine had been meticulously working on for months, testing the Russian energy grid and internal resistance. Moscow's energy shield had been dismantled piece by piece since the end of September. These images are not from the Eastern Front in Ukraine, from Kharkiv. The ice sculpture you see on the screen is the exterior of what was once a warm apartment building. This is Podolsk, just a few kilometers from Moscow. And this winter, the war came to Russia's doorstep like this. While the Kremlin used energy as a weapon to bring Ukraine to its knees, the eyes of the world were on the missiles and tanks. But the real battle was being fought silently and deeply within Russia's own lifelines. Now, in the fourth and most brutal winter of the war, Putin's strategy has backfired with one of history's greatest ironies. The weapon designed to freeze Ukraine has turned its barrel around and is now shooting its owner. This is no accidental malfunction. It is the inevitable result of decades of decaying infrastructure being sacrificed to feed the war machine. For millions of Russian citizens, the war is no longer a propaganda show watched on television. It is a bone-chilling cold felt inside their homes. To understand the origins of this total collapse, we must look beyond a burst pipe or a burning transformer and examine the first domino that started the chain reaction, the Kremlin's deliberate choices. This catastrophe is not an accident, but the physical manifestation of a series of decisions signed on paper with priorities clearly defined. Vladimir Putin announced that he was raising defense spending to a record level unseen since the Cold War, exceeding 7% of gross domestic product. However, who would pay this price was quietly hidden in the footnotes of the budget. In this vast country, spread across 11 time zones, millions of people are now victims not only of war, but also of neglect and destruction. Last winter, hundreds of thousands of people in 43 different regions were forced to live for days without heat, water, or electricity due to burst pipes and collapsed heating systems in temperatures reaching -30°C. Now the same crisis is looming again. This time the situation is even more dire because Putin's Russia is preparing to freeze not only at the front, but also in its cities. The energy infrastructure has collapsed. Municipalities have gone bankrupt and local governments are powerless. The timeline of the collapse proves how the Kremlin ignored the impending disaster. The first step of the operation took place in Belgorod between September 28th and October 6, 2025. Belgorod had been Russia's main logistics hub since the start of the war, and the Kremlin considered it expendable. On September 28th, the Luch power plant was hit multiple times. Local telegram channels confirmed water and power outages across large parts of the city. When Russian repair crews partially restored the facility, Ukraine struck again on October 6th. This second strike was a military message. You won't be able to repair it. As a result, more than 40,000 civilians were left without electricity and water for days. This was not just a strike on a military target. It was a laboratory test of the collapse of the home front. Ukraine was gauging the panic effect striking civilian infrastructure would have on the Russian people. The results exceeded even their expectations. The chaos in Belgorod was a harbinger of things to come. Just days after the test phase succeeded on October 1st, the drone attacks shifted south to the Rostov Oblast. The Verkhnedonsky and Sholokovsky districts were completely blacked out by midnight attacks. Rostov was not a civilian testing ground like Belgorod. It is the main command and supply center of Russia's southern military district. The disruptions here hit railway control centers, military command shelters, and communication relays more than civilian homes. Ukraine proved that it could target not only civilian morale, but also the nervous system of the Russian war machine. In mid-October, the nature of the operation changed. The target was no longer the border regions, but Russia's strategic depth. On October 16th, the media ran headlines such as "Lights Out in 3 regions." The focus of the operation was the Balashevskaya transformer station in the Volga Oblast. This strike was different from the previous pin-prick attacks. It signaled the beginning of a strategic stranglehold targeting key resources. This strike was the first blow to the backbone of the Russian energy grid. And just 48 hours after the preparatory strike on October 16th, on October 18th, the strategic checkmate move came. This was the keystone of the entire operation. Ukrainian drones destroyed the Veshka 500 kV main substation, located approximately 1,500 km from Kiev and more than 900 km deep inside Russia. The importance of this target cannot be overstated. A 500 kV substation is the toll booth of the national grid. It was the main hub where tens of thousands of megawatts of power from the Zhigalvskaya HPPP, one of Russia's largest hydroelectric power plants, were distributed to all of central Russia, including Moscow. The strike on Veshkima meant cutting off Moscow's main HPP line. This was the evaporation of the capital's main power source. Russian engineers were in shock. The grid instantly destabilized. The only remaining option to keep Moscow running was to draw power from weaker secondary lines in the west and south. And Ukraine knew that this is exactly what the Russians would do. The moment Russian engineers shifted power westward to compensate for the disaster at Veshka, Phase 2 began on October 21st. Smolensk and Bryansk were hit. The trap was closed. Ukraine had in effect forced Russia out of its home and locked the emergency exit doors it was trying to flee through. Moscow's energy siege was complete with this ingenious 5-step strategy. The ripple effect of this chain of attacks runs much deeper than the cut electricity. They lost both the power plants and the military facilities. This demonstrated that Russian air defense no longer provides functional deterrence, serving only propaganda value. The conclusion reached by independent analyses was brutal. Russia's systemic inadequacy in protecting critical infrastructure is no longer just a military problem, but a direct existential threat to Moscow. The castle walls have fallen, and now Muscovites are directly paying the price for the collapse of this analyzed military strategy and strategic chess game. The war has moved from propaganda posters and television screens to striking the sockets and radiators in Moscow's luxury suburbs. This is a textbook example of a collapse of the home front. Before the final collapse on October 21st, the first tremor occurred on October 10th, in the prestigious area known as New Moscow, where the regime's wealthy and loyal elite live. Dozens of homes were left without electricity. The Kremlin's response was an admission of panic. First, they lied about an emergency and a technical malfunction. But this lie collapsed immediately. As the data also confirmed, this outage occurred while the smoke from the power plant fires in Belgorod and Rostov was still rising. The public knew this was no accident. Local reports stated that the accident could not be resolved. This simple statement concealed the scale of the disaster. The reason it could not be resolved was that the system was already in a state of critical instability due to the Veshkima strikes. The grid's reserve capacity was gone. The plunging of New Moscow into darkness was symbolic. It was the first sign that even the regime's most loyal supporters could no longer be protected. It was the first major crack in the Kremlin's wall of propaganda. If New Moscow was the first tremor, Podolsk was the final earthquake. After the strikes on October 21st, social media images from this Moscow suburb documented the collapse of civil society. No water, no electricity, no heating. These three no's are a domino effect. In a modern city, these systems are interconnected. After Smolensk and Bryansk was hit, the power grid collapsed. Without electricity, the municipal Voda Canal water pumping stations stopped. Water could no longer be pumped to the upper floors of buildings. Without electricity, the boiler rooms and circulation pumps of regional heating plants such as Kotelnaya did not work. This disaster occurred in October just as winter was approaching. This is not a loss of comfort, but a crisis of survival. And at the root of this crisis lay a report published months earlier by the Ukrainian media, but labeled propaganda by the Kremlin. This report documented that Russian civilian infrastructure was filled with 70% decayed equipment and was in a systemic crisis. This infrastructure, neglected for years and hollowed out by corruption, was already hanging by a thread. Ukraine's strategic attacks did not create this decayed system. They merely executed it. The war is in the homes of Muscovites. The frozen children in Podolsk are the ultimate proof of the regime's greatest failure. For now, the homeland has collapsed. This was Vladimir Putin's greatest fear. The foundation of his regime was built on a simple tacit social contract. This contract was, "Give me your political obedience and I will provide you with stability, security, and prosperity for Moscow." For years, this contract worked. The price of the war was paid by the poor regions of Siberia and the Far East. The soldiers sent to the front came from Buryatia and Dagestan. Moscow, meanwhile, remained isolated from this war, continuing to live in a glittering bubble. The Kremlin deliberately shielded the capital from the hardships of war because it feared the political consequences. One protest in Moscow was more dangerous than 10 protests in Siberia. Therefore, Moscow's stability was vital to the regime's survival. They can no longer protect it. Ukraine's Choke Moscow operation is more than a tactical success. It is a strategic checkmate. This is a strategy that directly burst Putin's Moscow bubble. The darkness in New Moscow and the cold in Podolsk are no longer just technical problems. They are a political inferno. This situation has also fueled anger against the regime. Moscow residents who watch the Ukrainian people freeze on television are now freezing themselves and beginning to question the regime's competence. This is the application of the psychological warfare strategy to the home front. However, the cruelest irony of this strategic move is that Ukraine stole this tactic directly from Russia's own playbook. As a report published on October 12th also highlights, Russia has been conducting a systematic campaign of energy infrastructure attacks against Ukraine's power grid since the first days of the war. Their goal was to freeze the Ukrainian civilian population in the middle of winter and bring down the Kiev regime. They failed. Ukraine decentralized, repaired, and resisted its grid under attack. Now Ukraine has taken this weapon, developed it, and turned it directly at the heart of the Kremlin. As independent analysts reported, Russia's energy infrastructure was 70% rotten and hyper-centralized. It was fragile, cumbersome, and riddled with corruption. Ukraine successfully applied the strategy that Russia tried and failed in Ukraine, using Russia's own weaknesses against it. Putin's energy weapon backfired and became the feared thing. The war was no longer just a special operation, but a frozen reality unfolding in the middle of Moscow's living room. This ingenious double-layered strangulation operation, which began in Belgorod in September, peaked in the Vuhler and Veshkimemer in October, and finally encircled Moscow with Smolensk and Bryansk on October 21st, left Russia facing a final internal crisis. For the Kremlin's propaganda of an invincible fortress and a protected capital has been destroyed. Moscow's lights are going out. Podolsk is freezing, and the Kremlin is merely watching as the war comes to its own doorstep and the ultimate internal chaos unfolds. So what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.